June 1944. The fate of Western Europe rested on one massive gamble: D-Day. For months, Allied commanders had prepared the largest amphibious invasion in history. Every beach was assigned, every tide calculated, every minute scheduled. But hidden inside the plan was a decision that would quietly follow American commanders for the rest of their lives. And, strangely, the key to that story wasn't American at all. It was Canadian. The 5 beaches. But one was different. The invasion of Normandy was split across 5 landing zones: Utah Beach, Omaha Beach, Gold Beach, Sword Beach, Juno Beach. American forces would take Utah and Omaha. British troops would land at Gold and Sword, and in between them, almost as a bridge between two empires, were the Canadians at Juno Beach. On the surface, Juno looked manageable. German defenses there were serious, but not expected to be the worst. That title was reserved for Omaha Beach. The American assumption: U.S. planners believed Omaha would be brutal, but survivable. Intelligence reports suggested German units there were under strength, second-rate, maybe even exhausted. So the plan pushed forward. Naval bombardments would soften defenses. Airstrikes would disrupt German positions. Then infantry would land and push inland fast. But something went wrong before the first American soldier even stepped onto the sand. The pre-invasion bombardment, meant to smash bunkers and artillery, was far less effective than expected. Bombs fell too far inland. Naval shells missed key strongpoints. And the Germans waiting above Omaha's cliffs? They were not second-rate. They were battle-hardened troops from the 352nd Infantry Division. Meanwhile, the Canadians hit Juno at nearly the same time. Canadian troops were landing at Juno Beach. Their first waves took heavy fire. Casualties mounted. Beach obstacles slowed everything. But Canadian units adapted fast. Small groups pushed through seawalls. Engineers cleared exits. Officers reorganized scattered men under fire. Within hours, they were moving farther inland than almost any other Allied force that day. By afternoon, Canadian troops had advanced deeper than planned. Farther, in fact, than many American units struggling just a few miles away at Omaha. And this is where the quiet mistake began to take shape, because on Allied maps, the beaches were supposed to connect. But they didn't. The gap no one wanted between the American forces at Omaha and the Canadians at Juno, a dangerous gap opened. American troops at Omaha were pinned down, disorganized, and suffering far heavier resistance than planners had predicted. The Canadians, pushing forward, were suddenly ahead of schedule and exposed on their flanks. This created a terrifying possibility. If German forces counterattacked through the space between the beaches, they could split the Allied invasion in two. The success of D-Day, the entire Western Front, could have unraveled in the first 24 hours. And American commanders knew something chilling. They had underestimated the wrong beach. The gap that could have broken the invasion. By late morning on D-Day, the Allied invasion wasn't unfolding the way planners had imagined. Some beaches were moving forward. Others were barely surviving, and between them, a crack in the Allied line was widening. Omaha was still burning. At Omaha Beach, American units were still pinned near the shoreline. Officers were dead or missing. Radios were lost in the surf. Small groups of soldiers fought their way forward without knowing where neighboring units were. What commanders feared most was happening. They had men on the beach, but not control of the battlefield. The original schedule was gone. The tidy arrows on invasion maps meant nothing now. Meanwhile, the Canadians were ahead of plan at Juno Beach. Canadian forces had pushed farther inland than expected. They had broken through strong points, cleared exits, and were moving toward their inland objectives faster than planned. That success created a new danger. Because to their west, American forces at Omaha had not advanced at the same speed, and to their east, British forces were still consolidating. The Canadians were suddenly sticking out. like a spear tip with no shield on either side. The gap becomes real. Recon reports began reaching Allied naval commanders offshore. There was open ground between Omaha and Juno. German units still controlled villages and roadways in that space. If those forces counterattacked, they could drive straight toward the sea. If that happened, they wouldn't just hit one beach. They could split the invasion in two. This was the nightmare scenario planners had discussed, but never truly believed would happen on day one. A hard decision at sea. Aboard Allied command ships, officers faced an ugly truth. They couldn't wait for Omaha to catch up, so they began redirecting naval gunfire and air support away from pre-planned targets, and toward German positions threatening the gap. It was a gamble. Supporting Canadian advances meant fewer resources for American troops still struggling at Omaha, but ignoring the gap could doom the entire invasion front. For the first time that day, the invasion plan wasn't being followed. It was being improvised in real time. Canadian units feel the pressure. Canadian patrols moving inland began encountering more resistance than expected. German units that might have faced Americans instead were now colliding with advancing Canadians. Officers on the ground realized something wasn't right. They were farther ahead than neighboring forces. Flanks were uncertain. Communications were thin, but orders were clear. Keep pushing. Hold what you take. Don't let the enemy regroup. They weren't just advancing anymore. They were unknowingly buying time for the entire Allied invasion. What haunted American commanders? Later years after the war, some U.S. officers quietly admitted something that rarely made headlines. If the Canadians had stalled that afternoon, if German forces had punched through the gap, the D-Day landings might have fractured before the Allies secured a foothold. The mistake wasn't just underestimating Omaha, it was assuming every beach would move forward at roughly the same speed. War didn't work like that. And on June 6, 1944, it was Canadian momentum that prevented a developing disaster from becoming a historic defeat. And to their east, British forces were still consolidating. The Canadians were suddenly sticking out, like a spear tip with no shield on either side. The gap becomes real. Recon reports began reaching Allied naval commanders offshore. There was open ground between Omaha and Juno. German units still controlled villages and roadways in that space. If those forces counterattacked, they could drive straight toward the sea. If that happened, they wouldn't just hit one beach. They could split the invasion in two. This was the nightmare scenario planners had discussed, but never truly believed would happen on day one. A hard